Welcome back, everyone, to another episode on Living Your Greatness. This is your host, Ben Mummy, and the goal of my show is really simple: to learn from those who have mastered their craft at what they do. If you're new to my show, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Today, I am joined by G. Edward Griffin. He is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, the founder of both the Red Pill University and Freedom Force International. So, without further ado, Edward, it is a pleasure to have you with us on the show today.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here, indeed.
Thank you for being here, Edward. I want to start off by sharing with my listeners your origin story. So
Yeah,
tell us
or
about your formative years growing up and what inspired you to become a writer and a documentary film producer.
wow. Well, how much time do we have? Well, it is a big long story, but it gets boring after a while. It's a typical story, and by that I mean, yeah, I have written some books, and a lot of people have read my books, thank goodness. And I get stopped once in a while in an airport or a restaurant and say, "Oh, are you Ed Griffin?" Yeah, and that's kind of it's freaky because I never thought anybody would know anything about me. But so yeah, I have some very minor celebrity status. Well, how did this begin? Well, believe me, Ben, it didn't start out that way. I think most people travel through life and they wind up in a place that they didn't expect that they were heading for it. And that certainly was my case. I was born in Detroit, and I was born into a kind of a broken family. And fortunately, I was taken out of that bad environment and raised by a school teacher aunt and my grandmother. And so I was kind of rescued. I have some brothers and sisters who weren't rescued, and I hardly know them, but when I have met with them, I realized that, you know, they have taken a different path than I did. And unfortunately, we have very little in common. And I consider myself to be very fortunate in that I was rescued from that environment. But anyway, that's a side story. Uh, After I was sort of adopted, you might say, by my aunt, and it got into a nice, wholesome, middle class environment. Uh, I began to, for some reason, accidentally got into, I don't know quite what you would call it. I'll tell you the story. I went to a new grade school. I used to skip school a lot. And so I, uh, I was one of those bad boys, little kids when I was back in Detroit. And so I missed a lot of classes. I didn't have my lessons. And so when did go to class, I was always a standout in that I didn't know anything. And that made me even more embarrassed and drove me to skip more classes because I didn't like to be laughed at and so forth. They didn't use dunce caps in those days, but if they had, I would have been the guy wearing a dunce cap. So when I finally came to my aunt's home on the other side of Detroit, I went to Nolan grade school, and there they had a class there called auditorium. That was the name of the class. And a little auditorium and a stage, and they asked everybody if they knew anything at all that they would like a poem or could they sing a song or play the piano or anything to get on stage, you know. Well, I didn't know anything, but oh yeah, I did know something. Aunt Alice had a little baby grand piano, a Wurlitzer, and I learned how to play chopsticks on that thing. So yeah, I can play piano. So they got me up there in the front and I played chopsticks. And for the first time in my life, Ben, I heard a sound that I didn't think I would ever hear. It was the sound of applause. I was being approved of having done something. Well, that felt pretty good. Maybe there is something I am worthy to do. And I owe a lot to that teacher. Her name was Miss Schweitzer. And she encouraged me. Well, first thing you know, I had a part in the Christmas play. And then I entered a speech contest sponsored by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And the topic was Patrick Henry. And blow me down if I didn't win the prize for Detroit. And first thing you know, I'm a little kid on stage. And I went and accepted an offer from the Detroit public school system to teach children who were interested about radio. Radio was the big thing in those days. Television hadn't arrived yet. So I went down to the class on Saturday morning for kids who wanted to learn how to use a microphone and find out what radio was all about and maybe do some acting. Well, that sounded like a lot of fun. So that's what I did Saturday morning. And I remember I went down there. This might take a long time. I'll try and cut it short. But I think it's important if for somebody, if they're interested in maybe little things changing their lives in a big way. I went to this class and there was a big studio that they had built, big enough to hold an orchestra and a lot of musical instruments and a lot of people. It was a big studio, but it was packed with kids and had so many kids they didn't have enough chairs and you had to stand around the outside and sit on the floor and all that sort of. I was way in the back on that first day, and they taught us, well, this is a microphone. This is called a script. You read from the script and read with the lines, and you act in what the lines say. And the director is up there behind the glass, and if he points at you, that means go. And if he does this, that means speed up. If he does this, that means slow down, and all of those things. If that means cut, stop what you're doing. So I thought, no, isn't that interesting? So the next week came back on Saturday, and the room was about half full. And the next week, it was about a quarter full. And I kept coming back, and the first thing, it didn't take very long. There were 8 of us left in this whole thing that were really interested in pursuing it. We stuck with it. Well, naturally, when the local radio stations needed child actors, well, that's where they went to find out what little brats there were that knew what a microphone was and so forth. And I started getting jobs, you might call them. I actually got paid I was on the Lone Ranger, for example. That came out of WXYZ in Detroit, ABC network. And if you ever hear any of those old programs of the Lone Ranger, if you hear a kid say, "Gee, Dad, here come the Indians," or whatever the line was, might have been me. And it was on the Hermit's Cave and Ford Theater. And then as I got into high school, I tried out and I won the position of a teenage master of ceremonies on a program called Make Way for Youth. And that was, I think that was WWJ, and that would be the NBC outlet. So I actually, in a sense, I was the master of ceremonies on a teenage show called Make Way for Youth with Don Large, the choir and the orchestra. And I just read the lines and so forth and introduced the songs and cracked a few jokes that were written for me. So I got to be a bratty little kid that was on radio a lot. So naturally, when I went to school, I thought, well, I'm going to go into the field of radio communications and theater and all that sort of thing, which I did. And I went to the University of Michigan, and I got a job there as a radio announcer at the local radio station, WUOM. And so I was an announcer. I worked my way through school in that way. And then when I got out of school, of course, I got married almost immediately and got a job at WWJ TV. By this time, television had arrived. And WWJ TV was a big studio, about as modern as any you would find in New York. And I was hired as an assistant TV director, not acting, but in the production side, which interested me more. And so I did that. Then it was time to go in the military. So I thought, well, they were looking for people to staff their radio propaganda outpost, where you go into where the enemy lines are and you broadcast music and tell the enemy soldiers how great it would be if they would surrender. We would give them benefits and treat them nicely and so forth. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do. That's better than being in the trenches trying to kill people. And so I signed up. And when I got in there, to my amazement, that's not what they had in mind for me. So they gave me a test, and since I had been hanging around radio engineers a lot, I got the lingo. I knew what a rheostat was on the radio board. I knew a lot about radio tubes a little bit because I just listened to these guys talk. They had to replace a vacuum tube and so forth. So I guess I did better on the IQ exam that I took when I went into the Army, they decided they didn't need anybody in radio outposts anymore. They wanted people who could man radar systems. So they thought I knew something about electronics, which I really didn't, but that's what they assigned me to. So I went through radar school, and then when that was done, they made me an instructor because I really studied hard, and I got good grades, and they decided, well, I'd be better as an instructor rather than as an operator, repairing radar systems. And the rest of my class went up to the Dew Line in Alaska to maintain radar systems, supposedly to protect our northern border against incoming missiles and all that sort of thing. So I stayed at Fort Bliss, Texas, and I hadn't been teaching radar more than about 2 or 3 weeks. And all of a sudden on base there at Fort Bliss, I saw a guy, he was by this time a colonel, and I knew him from Detroit. He had been an agent, an actor's agent and I knew him at WWJ-TV. And of course, I'm just a corporal. So I see this guy and I saluted. I said, I know you, I know him. And he spoke to me, he says, Ed, is that you? And I said, yeah. Is that you? Yeah. So he invited me to have a cup of coffee. You asked me the question, so here it comes. So we had a cup of coffee. What are you doing? He said, well, I'm in charge of the entertainment schools here, the service clubs, they called them. That's where the soldiers could go after hours and participate in listening to music or art. They have art classes there, or they sometimes even had dances. I don't know where the girls came from, but they had a few dances. And so he was in charge of that. He says, I need somebody that knows about showmanship here. He says, I have no help. I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm teaching guys how to make radar systems work. He said, well, I'll see what I could do. Well, a couple of days later, I got my orders. I was being transferred as to be his assistant. Oh, that was cool. Now, 2 more weeks later go by, and he's transferred to the swamps of Louisiana. He must have done something wrong. So he was down there, and I was left running this whole thing for Fort Bliss. I'm just a corporal. Well, they needed an officer, of course, so they brought in a second lieutenant that didn't know beans about any of this stuff. So even though he was officially in charge, he just let me do everything. So that's how I, quote, fought the war. You know, I'm almost embarrassed to tell the story, but that's what happened. It was a cushy thing, and I had a ball. Well, okay. As part of that job, there was a USO tour coming through the base, and you know they usually bring in actors and actresses. They always bring actresses in, and singers, and they put on skits and sing and do dance and routines, and they like comedians and so forth. So I was in charge of making those work when these USO tours came through Fort Bliss, and one of them was led by Raymond Burr. Now most people would know Raymond Burr because he was the star in, I think it was Old Ironsides or something like that, a TV series. But at that time, he was unknown. He was the guy that played the actor that played in Rear Window, and his leg was in a cast and so forth. He saw a murder through his binoculars because he was stuck in a wheelchair in an apartment building. He had nothing to do except to spy on all of the people across the way. So he saw the murder committed through his binoculars, and of course the murderer noticed it just by accident, and he was in trouble because he figured the murderer was going to come over and whack him too. So that's the story. There's a pretty famous story called Rear Window. Well, that was Raymond Burr came through in charge of this little show, and my job was to generate an audience for him and get the PA system set up and the bleachers set up. It was done outdoors, and to get the lights and everything, and to get the props for him and everything that he needed. So I got to know Burr because it took us a couple of days to set that up and rehearse it and all that. And when it was all over, my job was to take him back to his hotel room in El Paso there. And when we got there, he invited me into the hotel and he said, well, would you like a drink? I said, well, I guess I'm off duty now, so yeah. Well, okay, here's where it gets interesting. So Raymond Burr got a little soused, and before we broke up, that he said, "Well, Ed, what are you gonna do when you leave this man's army?" I said, "Well, I guess I'm gonna go back to Detroit where I was, and maybe go back to work for the TV station." He said, "Well, why don't you come on out to Hollywood, and I'll introduce you to the right people, or fix you up, get you going." I said, "You would do that?" "Yeah. Here's my card. Call me." So I thought, wow, what a good thing that was. Well, fortunately, I was pretty close to getting out at that time. It was maybe a month or 2 months later. I was discharged, and first thing I did was jump in my jalopy and went to Hollywood. And I took a motel room there, and I called him on the phone the next day, and he answered the phone, and I said, "Hi, Raymond. This is Ed Griffin." There was a long silence. He said, "Who?" I said, "Ed Griffin." Silence. Ed Griffin, remember with the USO trip back in El Paso, and we put on the show, and you told me to come on out and look you up when I got here. "Oh, oh yeah, oh yeah, well, how you doing?" Ed, was it? He didn't remember me at all. But there I was. Yeah, we had lunch that day, and that was the end of it. I thought, well, there goes my big inside connection, and but I'm in Hollywood. All right, now let's cut to the real message here. If there is a message, here it comes. I found out that in Hollywood there was a lot of talent, much better than mine, and most of these young people were wasting their lives waiting table or washing cars, not taking a real job because they wanted to be available in case they got called by casting or something. And they were wasting their lives. And they had more talent than I did, for sure. I thought, well, by this time I'm married. I've got a kid already, and then another one in the hatch. I think I better get serious about making a living. So I decided to get a real job, and I got a job with a large insurance company in well, actually, it was sales assistants. I wasn't the salesman, but I would assist the salesman because I actually had to calculate the rates for group insurance policies for companies. So the salesman might close the deal, but he didn't know anything about group insurance. So they had to have somebody from home office come out and do the calculations for the prices and explain the benefits and construct the policy for that company. And that was my job. And I did very well at it, and I was climbing the corporate ladder. I decided, okay, this is a good company. It's a big company. All the top management ahead of me were really old people. I figured they were going to be retired pretty soon, and they had to fill those positions with young guys in the organization. So I better be really sharp and be noticeable as a up-and-coming shooting star, which I did my best to do. And I was succeeding. And I thought, well, this is my life. I'm going to be in the insurance business for the rest of my life. And but then I ran across some information in a pamphlet, which was completely out of my world. It had to do with the future of our country and the fact that the principles for which our country was founded on were being eroded, and that we were being invaded from the inside by people with alien, or at least alien to us, ideologies. We were talking about communism in those days primarily, and so I became very aware of that. And I read this little booklet about the United Nations not being what we were told it was. Now I was outraged. How dare they criticize the United Nations? Because I'd been through school. I knew that was our last best hope for peace. But I took this booklet to heart, and I said, I wonder if this could be some truth to this. And I did a little research at the library. I found out that, by golly, everything that was said in that little booklet, written by some obscure college professor in the Midwest, was true. Well, that shocked the heck out of me, and I decided, well, I better start telling others about this. So I got some film strips on the topic, and I bought a film strip projector and a recorder, and I started telling people that I would be willing to show these films after work there in the meeting room of the insurance company. Well, no, it was open to me. So I started telling people about it. And the first thing you know, they were handing me information about problems in America uh, involving other things than the United Nations. Well, this changed my life. No longer was I interested in being um, a show off or an actor or somebody in the center of attention. I I wanted to literally, it sounds crazy, but I wanted to save the world. And I didn't know I had that crusader gene, but it started to rattle and it changed my life. So from that point, eventually, about a year later, I resigned from my job and decided to do this full time. And now at least I could speak. That's what I was trained to do. I would give speeches and so forth, and I could stand in front of a group, and then I knew how to make films. I had been in films. I've been in that industry. I thought, well, maybe I can use my skills after all in production, but in this field. And so I started to produce little, very low budget documentary film strips. They weren't full films because I couldn't afford that. And they were very popular. I made a little money on it, so I turned that around and got some real camera equipment, 16 millimeter stuff and sound recorders. And first thing you know, I'm producing very low budget documentary films. And interesting enough, is about that period that I made some films which they were, they paid for themselves, but not many people saw them. And it wasn't until about maybe 4 years ago that these films were discovered on the internet. I didn't put them up there. And they went viral. I've still got a couple of them that are going viral. Millions of people have seen these films that I produced back in those days. Very low budget stuff. And all of a sudden, because of the internet and the fact that conditions in America have changed so drastically, that what I saw way back then became really obvious by now, and there were more and more people interested in being alarmed. So that's the story in a nutshell. Believe it, that was a nutshell. But I think the essence of the story is that what got me there, I don't know. It was a series of accidental encounters with different people, different ideas, different environments. And I don't know, I kind of feel a little bit spiritual about that. I'm not a super religious guy, but I think maybe it was meant to be, that I was sort of moved in a certain direction that I feel was proper for me. And that's it. So I'm a crusader, and I'm proud of it, and I'm glad of it. Well, I shouldn't say proud, I'm glad of it. I think had I stayed in Hollywood, if I had made it at all, I probably would have been totally corrupted and probably a druggie or something and dead. If I'd stayed with the insurance company, I'm sure I would have been dead by now, because part of my job was to take all the heads of these various corporations out to lunch, meet with them at least once a year, and I had a big portfolio. I had to meet with somebody almost every day. And of course, when you take them out to lunch, and most of these guys would like a cocktail, and you have a couple of drinks every day, and it already was getting to me. I was becoming an addict in this sense, because I was looking forward to those lunches. And I realized that in the insurance company, all the guys above me their health was shot, and that was because of that kind of thing. And I would have been in the same queue. So it's all turned out well. And but now the real thing is, I started to write. I didn't know I could write. I thought my forte was public speaking, film production, that kind of thing. But I became very, very ill. I'd been drinking a lot, but I've been on the road I was on a lecture series, I was training people, and I'd just been traveling every day. I'd come back, have the meeting, and have a few drinks with the guys, and we'd stay up till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning talking about world events, then get up at 6 in the morning and drive somewhere and do the same thing day after day. And I finally came back home one day, and I was just out, and I was trying to plant a tree in front of my house, and all of a sudden I just froze up. I became paralyzed, literally paralyzed. I said, what the heck is this? Well, I called the people out, the medics, and they said, well, they thought I had a stroke, but I didn't. Went to the doctors. 2 doctors diagnosed me as multiple sclerosis. Wow, I didn't know what that was. I didn't sound good, but when I looked it up, I knew how bad it was. I said, man, I'm through. And I really thought I was through. But it was during that time that I got a call from a publisher, a book publisher, and this guy said, "I hear that you've been giving a lot of speeches on the United Nations, and people are very impressed by that. We're looking for somebody to write a book on the United Nations. Would you be interested?" Well, I was sure I couldn't write. That was not what I did. But there I was in bed, sort of paralyzed. I found out later that I really didn't have multiple sclerosis. I just worn down my immune system, and I recovered from that. But anyway, there I was thinking that I was on my way out. I had to support my family. I had no income. So instead of saying, "I don't know how to write," I said, "Yeah, no problem." So I got the job of writing a book, and I was scared to death because I knew I couldn't write. But anyway, I had to do it. So I got all my research together, and I got all my documentation, and then it was finally time to write. And we've all seen movies about writer's block, the guy that I can't write, tear up the paper, throw it away, type 3 words, throw it away. I went through that literally. I couldn't write. This is where I fail. This is where I'm exposed as a fraud. And I was so angry. I remember I was writing all, of course, pencil on paper, and I threw a piece of paper away, and I said, "All right, this time I'm just going to write something like Mary Had a Little Lamb." Just going to start writing, just for get my hand moving. And I started, and all of a sudden I found myself writing something about how can you describe something as complex as the United Nations in a simple book. And I remember I wrote, "It's like a big glass sphere, so big and so smooth that you can stretch out your arms, but you can't grab it because it's too big and too smooth. And how do you grasp that?" And I remember saying, "Well, this topic is like, it's so big, like trying to move a mountain, and all you have is a shovel. And so the answer is, well, you start with this first spade, and this is it." And I thought, hey, that's kind of clever. I read it. Oh, let's see where that goes. First thing you know, an hour later, I'm writing away. You couldn't stop me. I sort of stopped, looked up at the wall, and said, "My God, I can write." Well, the reason I tell you that story is because had it not been for this catastrophe, this tragedy, this what I thought was a tragedy, I wouldn't have been nudged out of my path and have been thrown into a path that I guess by the fact that so many people have bought my books, they must like them. So I guess I must say, well, I can write. But I would never have known that. And I guess that's the main thing about all of the things that have happened in my life, including my health and all these things, that the worst things that have ever happened to me turned out to be the best things, because they forced me to go in a different direction than what I was headed. And that's the bottom line of my life story, believe it or not. It's not what I've accomplished. It's just the things that I wouldn't have been anything, I don't think, of worth anybody would be willing to imitate or find out, how did you do this or anything like that, had I not met all kinds of tragic roadblocks that caused me to change my direction.
Well, Edward, I really appreciated, hearing about your formative years, and more importantly, the journey that it was, to become the person you are today. But something that I'm curious to ask is, who were some of your greatest mentors, and how did they shape your views on economics and, more importantly, the Federal Reserve?
Well, the reason I'm pausing is that there's some difference there. Um, my strongest mentors are people that most people have never heard of. There's one that was particularly formative for me. His name was Dan Smoot. Dan Smoot was a little short guy, but he was a former FBI agent. And as an agent, he discovered some of the things that I've just been talking about. He discovered that there were major trends going on, movements going on within the government, that although he was in the FBI, he was not free to talk about. And it bothered him that here he was with an agency of the federal government, supposedly to protect the federal government, seemingly in some cases actually protecting the very subversive elements that they were supposed to be exposing and eliminating. So he quit the FBI and he started on his own, and he produced something called the Dan Smoot Report. And in a way, it was somewhat like myself. It was just, he'd sit down every week in front of a 16 millimeter camera and deliver a short monologue, which was also printed in the Dan Smoot Report for, I think it was probably 6 pages or something like that, 8.5 by 11. And he would go in depth into some aspect of an issue that affected American traditions, ideology, security, and so forth. But the thing that impressed me was that his method of delivering information was so precise. You could tell he worked on it. It was nothing off the cuff. He had documentation, and he didn't waste any time repeating himself. Everything was in logical sequence that if you had to know something before you could appreciate something else, it was in that order. And I admired him so much that I tried to imitate him and as best I could. And so, but nobody knows who Dan Smoot is. Although his stuff still remains, and I have a complete collection of it in my library. I got involved in the John Birch Society. Now, I know a lot of people think the Birch Society is a wacko organization. Back in the day, we came under attack by the forces of destruction, as I call them. At the time, we were worried about communists, but I discovered since then that the communists and the fascists and the Nazis are really no different. And this idea of a right wing and a left wing opposing each other is nonsense. But back in those days, I didn't know that. I thought you either had to be one or the other. You had to be a right winger or a left winger. And most people today still fall for that. What are you, Republican or Democrat? They don't think that maybe either one is a good idea. But anyway, so the John Birch Society was an educational organization made up of some of the finest people I've ever met. Still an organization that's underway, but it came under attack by the media, and they had everybody believing that we were all a bunch of anti-Semites or Nazis or something like that. And because they read about it in the newspaper, it was true to them. It wasn't true, of course, but I knew then that we were, as they say, when you're getting shot at and you're flying along and you get a lot of flak, you're over the target, and that's what it was. We were trying to expose some of this stuff, and so they had to get rid of us, and so they called us a lot of names, as I say, like my neighbors even thought I was anti-Semitic or a communist or a Nazi. They didn't know what I was, but they knew they'd read about us in the paper. And my poor wife, at church where she had a lot of friends, all those people, those ladies would avoid her. They wouldn't sit next to her, all that kind of thing. It was a very tough time to go through. But the point is that Robert Welch, who was the founder of that organization, was a kind of a genius type, a very bright kid. In fact, I wound up writing his biography. He asked me if I would do that, and I said, well, gee, I'd be honored to do that. I had already written a book on the United Nations, so they knew I could write, and he asked me if I'd write his biography. And I said, I'd be honored to do so, but I said, are there any conditions? And he said, no. I said, you mean no matter what I write, even if I say something that's not complimentary, it's okay? And he looked at me and he said, well, yes. I said, okay, then there are no holds barred, and I can feel free to do it. So he said, yes. So I wrote his book, and I got to know Robert Welch, I think better than he knew himself, because I interviewed at great length the people that worked for him, his mother, for example. Well, she didn't work for him, but she was by this time in her 90s, very active old lady, sharp as a tack. And she told me stories about him as a boy. And I talked to his son, and I talked to people who knew him perhaps better than he knew himself, and they would share things with me. So I came away with, I think, a pretty good knowledge of who the man was. And he was not without faults, of course. One of about the only fault I can think of is that he had somewhat of a little Napoleon complex, because he was a small boy. In fact, I found a photograph of him that I put in the book. He's a 14-year-old kid in the graduating class at North Carolina, the University of North Carolina. He's 14 years old. He's graduating from college. He'd already completed the courses, flawlessly. His mother was a teacher. She taught him at home as well. And here he is in this photograph of his graduating class, and all these guys are big 6-foot tall guys, and he comes up to their breastbone, And it looks so weird to see this little kid. What's this kid doing? Well, he's in the graduating class. And he was a genius, literally. But he had personality things, and he didn't like to be challenged too often. And for good reason, he was usually right. I mean, people were not as knowledgeable in most things as he was. But there were some things that he didn't know much about. And he didn't understand automobiles and carburetors and things like that. He had some weird ideas about how an automobile worked. But when you came to history or philosophy and ideology and things like that, this man was absolutely brilliant. So I wrote his biography. And so I learned a lot from him. His knowledge of history was just absolutely unbeatable. But so I wrote that, and let's see, go on. Who else? Well, I wrote another book on cancer. I wrote a book called World Without Cancer, the story of vitamin B17. And the reason I got into that one is because a good friend of mine was a doctor, Dr. John Richardson, MD, had a thriving practice in the San Francisco area as an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist, family practice. But he, like me, was pulled into a specialty that he'd never intended, which was cancer, because his office manager, Ralph Bowman, had stumbled across the works of, they called him a doctor, but he was a PhD. He was a doctor. Ernst T. Krebs Jr., he and his father especially, and then he picked it up later, had discovered the anti-cancer effect of a substance in nature. The substance is called amygdalin. But anyway, it's been known. You could find it in the pharmacopoeia on drugs and medicines that go way back, way over 100 years ago. And it was identified first in Europe as having anti-cancer properties, among other things. So they started messing around with it, and they found out, yeah, it's really very powerful. And so Ralph Bowman brought this information to his employer, which was Dr. Richardson, and said, Doc, you ought to try this on your people with cancer of the nose or throat or something. And he did, very cautiously, and it worked. And so Dr. John, being the man he was, highly principled man, started to use it and very cautiously expand its use, began to study it, became good friends with Dr. Krebs and learned everything he could from that side. And by the time I discovered it, when he brought it to my attention, he had unintentionally developed a cancer clinic. People weren't coming to him anymore for eye, ear, nose, and throat, sore throat or something. They were coming for cancer, and no matter where it was. And they were coming from all over the world. And I didn't know that, even though we were close friends. We never talked about it. But anyway, one day we were together. We were sort of on a little vacation trip up in Northern California to get away from the hustle and bustle. And he said, Ed, I need your help. I said, you need my help? What is it, John? He said, well, I'm in trouble with the California Medical Association. I said, what did you do? What did you do wrong? He said, well, I didn't do anything wrong, except I've been saving lives. Well, how can you be in trouble with the California Medical Association if you're saving lives? He says, well, Ed, you don't understand this job I got here. He says, I'm in the medical profession, and I've got all kinds of restrictions on what I can and cannot do in treating people. Okay, well, that's nice. I'm sure these people have the best interest in mind in setting up these restrictions. He says, not necessarily so. said, well, what do you mean? Tell me more. He said, well, I'll tell you what I want you to do, Ed, and I'm taking too long on this. I'll try and speed it up. He said, I've been using a substance in the treatment of cancer, and it is amazingly successful. It's much, much better than anything we've ever had from orthodox sources, which is, radiation, chemotherapy, and surgery. So those things sometimes work a little bit, but in the long run, you lose 90% of your patients anyway. But you can make a lot of money, which he says, I'm not interested in that. He says, I want to save their lives. And this stuff saves their lives. They don't make much money, but it saves their lives. And I said, well, so how come? What's the problem? He says, well, the problem is, Ed, that it's not approved. I said, approved? What do you mean approved? Well, you don't understand again. You can't treat a patient with a substance unless it's approved by the FDA. And he says, these jerks do not know what they're doing. And they refuse to look at the evidence that this stuff works. And they don't really care if it works. All they care is that you performed a certain series of experiments that take 6 or 10 years to complete and cost a lot of money just so only the big companies can do it. And he said, and the little guy like me, I can't spend $10 million on research to prove that something I already know, that something is working. And he said, so I can never, or people like me can never prove that something works because it's cost $10 million to do it. All we know is that it works. Patients are living. But no, the FDA says you got to go through the rigmarole and do all these tests and series and spend a lot of money and hire 20 or 30 people to do it. And so therefore it's unproven. And they equate unproven by their definition to equal the same as ineffective. And he said, no, it may be unproven according to their method of proof, but we've proven it through actual use. I said, well, isn't that interesting? He said, that's what I want you to write about. I said, okay, that sounds pretty good. It sounds like something I could get my teeth into, but I never knew at that point how much voltage was in the wire that I was going to grab hold of. I didn't realize how big an issue that was, not just in cancer, but in every other illness there is. It's infectious throughout the whole Western medical contract or the scenario. You have to play the game to protect the large pharmaceutical companies, or you don't play the game at all. And that's what I wasn't prepared for. I thought it would be just a simple matter of proving that these patients recovered and they're out playing golf now instead of in the 6 feet underground. But no, I discovered there were two sides to the story. There was the science of cancer therapy and the politics of cancer therapy, and that the science was relatively easy to understand, but the politics was mind-boggling because nobody would believe that there are those who would consciously withhold a control for cancer that was cheap, found in nature, and that really was highly effective, and they would do so knowingly just in order to make a buck. Nobody would believe that, including myself. I found that very hard to believe. But that's what I learned. And so I would say that John Richardson and what he taught me and led me into discovery also had a very profound effect on my life. And I would say if had it not been for that, I probably wouldn't be here either. I'd be dead from cancer or something else. But it forced me to learn something about health, which was not my interest either. And now here I am, 92 years old. I'm not doing too bad for that. The shocking part to me is I went to a funeral not too long ago, and there were services in the cemetery. And as I walked out, I was looking at all the dates, and I must have passed by a couple of hundred tombstones. I didn't look at all of them, but I looked at a lot of them. And all of the birth dates were after mine. It scared me to, my time is up. Well, statistically, I suppose it is. But had it not been for Dr. Richardson and what I learned about the reality of healthcare in America and around the world being dominated by the profit motives of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, if you think about it, it's obvious. If you've got a cancer patient and your treatments cost $150,000 or more, and as long as they've got a house that they can sell to pay you, you can clean out their estate, and then they die. But that's economically a good model. But if you cure their cancer with some apricot seeds that cost 52 cents, you just lost yourself $150,000 in income. So the incentive in the medical field is not to cure anything, because you lose your customer. But the incentive is to treat everything and to keep the condition going or worsening, so that you have to take those meds every single day for the rest of your life and send the money in, keep it coming. And then when you die, oh, well, you got life insurance, so now that takes care of it. Anyway, it sounds very cynical, but it's the truth. And I learned that because of my exposure to my friend John Richardson, Dr. Richardson, who's now passed away, not of cancer, by the way. But that's about it. I guess there have been a lot of people. My aunt, of course, who really had a profound effect on me when she took over my boyhood and started to teach me things. In fact, I was in a conversation just the other day about not learning from your elders what they're trying to teach you. And it made me think that she used to say a lot of things to me, and I didn't understand them until I got older. And one of them was this. She said, "I am brave enough to fight, but I am too cowardly to surrender." I didn't have any idea what that meant when I was a kid, but I do now, because that's kind of the world in which we live right now. It seems like it's so hopeless. How can we win? We should just give up and surrender. But then you look ahead and you think what happens to the people that have surrendered. Patrick Henry said it well. "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And that's kind of the world that we're coming into now. So you look backwards and you find all the wisdom is behind you to deal with the things that are ahead of you. And I guess that's kind of another thing I learned in my lifetime.
It was great to hear about all your mentors, and as well as, those inspiring words from your aunt and how that has had an impact on your life. And I'm sure a lot of my audience will also respect those words as well. But Edward, something that I did want to talk about is one of your most famous books was The Creature from Jekyll Island. And in that book, you describe the Federal Reserve as a creature born out of secret elite interest. And so what is something from your book that you think is extremely valuable for the everyday millennial to better understand?
Well, there are a lot of lessons in there, but first of all, let me say something about the millennial part. That's the easier part. I don't think it's just the millennial that needs to know this. There are a lot of us old duffers that never learned it too, And it reminds me of, well, here I go again. I get long-winded, but these are good questions, and it makes me think. When I was young in the field, when I was a millennial, let's say, I was very impatient. I would talk to people. We got to do this. We got to do that. The election's coming up, and then the old timers would say, "Calm down. This is not going to be done by the next election. This is a war that goes on. It affects all ages, and it's going to go on it's intergenerational. In other words." I said, "Well, that's what you say, but no, we got this election coming up. Who are you going to vote for?" I was very shallow in my thinking. I actually thought that if you just got some good guy into the White House, that somehow all of the millions and trillions of people out there whose brains are all screwed up would suddenly see the light and everything would be fine because we got somebody in the White House. I had no idea of the fact that you don't get into the White House unless you're compromised and somebody behind the scenes has control over you. I never dreamed that our presidents could be puppets. I thought they were the big cheese, I didn't know any of that. So I remember at that time, I was always the youngest person in the group. Well, I don't care what it was. Seemed like I was, he's a young guy. And these were all elders. And I don't know what happened. Somebody threw a switch. There was never anything in between. All of a sudden, I was the oldest guy in the group. I guess I had some missing time out of that. And but by this time, I had a different perspective. And one of the things I run into a lot among my colleagues, they said, Ed, we've got to do something to make this more attractive to the young people. We need young blood, right? Yeah, of course. And we need to get young people into the program. Yeah. Well, who are you going to have on this speakers platform? Get some young people up there. So I'd love to find some young people up there, and we do. But age is not the criteria. It's what they're saying. I don't care how old they are or young they are. Take a look at Ron Paul's experience. He's an old guy. He's almost as old as I, maybe the same. I don't know. But he got all the college kids. He got all the young people were. It wasn't because he was old or they were young. It's because his ideas were clear. And I don't care whether you're old or middle-aged or young. If you're open to ideas and you're hungry for truth, it makes no difference what your age is. So I have trouble getting that across to some of my old-timer buddies. They think we got to somehow, I don't know, get some rock band in there and make it attractive so everybody comes for the party. And then so no, they have to come looking for ideas. So having said that, your question really is, what is there about my book that's attractive to the millennials? Well, it's attractive to everybody. I think it's okay, let me start from the general to the specific. It's because it shows without any doubt that we are being lied to by the highest levels of authority. And you can see it. It's hard to refute it. Once you recognize that just because authority is saying to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. Now, I went through school. I was taught to respect your elders and all that. That's good. But I was also taught that you should obey authority without question. And when I was in the military, that was further hammered into me. Yours is to do or die, not to question why, and all of that sort of thing. Well, that's part of the training they want to put into us, so that if anybody who speaks from a position of authority says something, we are not supposed to question it. That to question it is wrong. That means you're not a team player, right? To be a team player is the ultimate thing. It's what they teach us in school. Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And the thing that I think in The Creature from Jekyll Island that is that sort of lines up with what I just said is that there's not much higher authority than money. Money is at the root of all evil, but also at the root of all good. Money is at the root of everything because we work together. We exchange services on almost everything. Some of it is volunteer, but most of it at some point has an exchange value and is expressed as money. So if you can be the person or the entity or the group of people that are involved with the exchange of money on every single transaction in the universe, you have an unusually powerful position that maybe most people don't even think about. If you are in a profession, we call it international banking, where you can actually create the money at will, just create it literally out of nothing. Didn't used to be that way, but that's the way it is now. Even worse than nothing because it's out of debt, but it's easy to create debt, especially when you got a government that's hungry for spending money. So if you're in the point where when you buy a stick of gum and it goes through a system and there's somebody behind the system that rakes off 3% or 1.5% of that stick of gum, or you buy a yacht and they rake off 1.5% of the yacht, everything from a stick of gum to a yacht or a huge airplane or a space craft or whatever, and somebody's back there always ripping off that 1 or 2%, you're looking at a river of gold that's so wide that you can't even think across it. And this river of gold is going into the control of a small group of people in the world. that they don't spend it all on themselves. They've already got as many yachts as they want. They've already got as many villas as they want. They've got as much money in the bank as they want. But they spend the rest of that in purchasing the loyalty of leaders in various fields, all the power centers in politics, in the schools, in the churches, in the labor unions. They offer money, and the educational system. They build temples and hospitals, and they build university buildings, and they buy the equipment for the training of doctors and so on. And all these people become dependent on that flow of money, and they become loyal to it. They have to be, otherwise they can't survive. And that's what I think people come away realizing, that this control over the flow of money in every transaction in the world gives a small group of people that kind of leverage over a large group of people, because the large group becomes loyal to the ones that are writing the checks. That is something that prepares them to understand the real world in which we live. Without that knowledge, they can't believe it. I mean, I was there. I didn't know about this. And I couldn't believe, well, why would doctors do that? And we see that right now in COVID. There are a lot of doctors who realize that they had been lied to by their sources of information. And now they want to stop recommending vaccines, or they want to just stop using them. But they can't, because they'll lose their jobs, they'll lose their license and so forth. And I've talked to these guys, and they said, I don't know what to do. I have to feed my family. Doctors saying that. You'd never think you'd hear that from a doctor, but that's what you're hearing. So back to your question, it sounds a little bit vague, but I think it is the true answer. Once people understand the magnitude of power that can be generated by this ability to create money out of literally nothing, you can buy politicians, you can buy people who aren't politicians and make them politicians. You can take somebody like Donald Trump, for example, who was never, you'd be the last person you'd think of being a politician, and not a very popular guy, but they make him, and they put him in the White House, and they control the media so that you have to compare Trump to Biden or something like that. And you say, well, it's the lesser of two evils. Well, that's how they get you. They tell you it's the lesser of two evils, but they're both evils, and they both control both sides. So, but that seems impossible to even imagine. Most people can't, oh, no, that's not it. That would never happen. Because how would it happen? They don't know. But once they understand the Federal Reserve System and how that is merely one piece in the international system around the world, that all monetary systems are based on that principle, then you can understand how it happens, and you become a little more aware of reality. And it's this unawareness of reality, this naivety that we all have, the thinking that everybody in positions of authority, they think that they're all honest, good people. They wouldn't lie to you. They wouldn't steal. They wouldn't have anything but your best interest in mind. It's that naivety that we have to overcome if we're going to survive as humans. And I think that the message that comes out of the creature from Jekyll Island is very important, because it shows the mechanism by which reality is operated and funded.
And Edward, you've described the Great Reset as a threat to individuals' liberties, emphasizing a move towards collectivist society. So what practical steps can people and communities take to preserve personal freedoms and resist pressures towards a collectivist agenda?
I have to answer it at a deeper level. But I'll start at the shallow level. I shouldn't call it the shallow level, but the surface view of that. How do you protect yourself? Well, you have to first become aware of how it works, because it's very subtle. I mean, they're offering people now, universal income, and so people think, well, isn't that wonderful? I get free money, and now they don't want to go to work. I just came back from an event that we put on in South Dakota, and 3 of my flights were canceled right under me, and so I had to stay over an extra 24 hours before I even got home. And this is not unusual. I was probably among the lucky ones. Almost everyone I've talked to who's been flying, they know that their flights are canceled and all the weird reasons and so forth. And so I had a lot of time in the airport. I was asking everybody that I could who worked there, say, what's going on with all these cancellations and all that? And you could tell they were kind of tight-lipped about it, but you joke around with them a little bit and they start talking freely. And one of the answers I heard more than once is that it's hard to find good people to work here. Why is that? Well, they make more money from the government by not working. That's why. Oh, isn't that interesting? Okay, so one of the things that you can do is to realize that all these benefits that are being offered, your free health care, now they're taking away your homes because you can't afford the taxes or the insurance, but they'll give you a place to live. Isn't that nice? All these benefits that the government is giving you gets you into the trap, so that now you might feel free to disagree with the government now, and the worst that can happen to you is that people look at you and say, who are you? What kind of a weirdo are you? But if they can take away your food, your clothing, your shelter, and your health care, because they're giving it to you free and you have to please them, you become a slave to the master. And that's what it's really all about. So if you want to go deeper, it's not just how you protect yourself. You've got to stop this process and become active in reversing it and getting rid of this system of welfare. And collectivism is really the better name for it. It's not just welfare. It's everything. They get you trapped into dependency on the rulers, and you think it's a good deal. Oh, get your 5G. Oh, that's good. I can get my movies downloaded faster. Oh, I don't want to be tracked though or anything. I don't want to be made sick or anything, but I sure want my movies faster. And we have to learn to think bigger than what this advertising is all about. What's underneath? Why are they doing that? They have more than one reason. Making money, of course, is obviously it. But these guys that are running the show today have something more than money. They already got the money. They don't need any more money. They can get as much as they want. Now they're looking for control over you and me and everybody else, so that we have to bow and look at the ground. When we talk to them, we must not look at them in the eye because we are inferior to them. This is what they really think. And so my answer to your question is, yeah, there are certain things you could do. You've got to get out of debt. Probably that'd be a good thing to do. Especially if the great taking comes through. If you have a mortgage on your house, they'll take it from you. That mortgage will be considered an asset, and it'll be taken by the government, even though you only owe $500 on it. They'll take a $500,000 piece of property and say, well, you didn't complete your payment, and now it's part of the pool, and we're going to allocate it now through society for everybody's benefit, for the greater good of the greater number. And you get what's left over, which is zero. Or you might have a number on a piece of paper, but you're not entitled to cash it in because they control your money through digital currencies now. And you said something in your email that you disapproved of this policy, and you're a troublemaker, and you're part of the problem. They'll blame you for the problem and so forth. So you won't ever get your house back. All these things, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm trying to impress the idea that all of these benefits, so-called benefits, that we eagerly are grateful for, really have a hidden meaning to them, a hidden quality to them, and that they provide further control over us as individuals if we step out of line. And so the answer to the question, how do we survive that, is not just to defend ourselves against it, because it's creeping. You can't. It comes to the point where you lose. I don't care what it is. You've got to stop it. So whatever your plan is, it should include a significant portion of your assets, of your mental energy, your physical strength, to reverse this process, to change it so that we can go forward again. We've been moving backwards all this time toward a condition of servitude that hadn't existed since the Dark Ages. where they had masters and slaves. This is what we're moving toward. I wouldn't say that's a forward motion, that's a backward motion. We have to move forward again to get back where we were and then go on. So my answer quite simply is that yes, you can defend yourself by getting out of debt, stockpiling food, making friends, make sure you have a community to help each other, get off of the meds, get on wholesome food and so forth, improve your health and all of those things. But unless we reverse this system and start going forward again, we're moving right straight into hell. And none of the other things will make any difference.
In terms of like the financial world right now, the system is not looking good at all. And I'm curious, like, to ask you, what economic trends do you foresee in like the next decade, and how should individuals prepare, to safeguard their financial well-being?
Well, that's sort of a retake on what I was just saying. You can prepare to some extent that you'll probably do better than others for a little while, but eventually it all goes away. But getting out of debt, we mentioned. I would say you need something to replace money, because they're going to force us to take their digital currencies, which means it's not our money. You can't possess it. You can't put it in your pocket. It's digital. It's online. You may have a number. Oh, look, you got 347 units or whatever that they'll call them. But do you? Maybe if you say something they don't like, they throw the switch and oh, where would it go? It's gone. You don't have it. It's not yours. I mean, with the money we have today, even though it's fiat money and not backed by anything, we could put it in a mattress or in a coffee can, and we could use it even if they don't like us. That's why they are so anxious to get to a digital currency so that we don't have anything else. Okay, so to answer your question, what could we use as something else? I still think that gold and silver has always worked in that direction. I think it still will. If you had some smaller units, which we're working on now how to do that. But I think in times of this kind of duress and stress, people will still be willing to, and if not eager, to accept gold coins or silver coins or anything else of value. Really, we're talking about barter now. But you can't barter something unless it has intrinsic value, something you can use for something else. I would think that if you had a warehouse full of cheap white wine, you'd probably do pretty good. I mean, people will always, in times of, this is a fact, by the way, it's kind of humorous, but sad at the same time. Anytime there's a crisis, especially an economic crisis, the gambling business and the booze business and prostitution business, they thrive because it becomes a kind of a form of barter. And I'm not recommending any of those things, you understand, but that's what happens psychologically in those times. So if you wanted to stock up on a warehouse full of tires, for example, people might be unable to buy tires, but at the same time, they probably won't be able to buy gasoline either. So you have to be careful what you stock up on. But food, I mean, I hate to say it, I'm not advocating violence, but I think everybody should have a gun and some ammunition. Somebody might be coming at your door that doesn't have your best interests in mind. And if you can't defend yourself, why, you're probably dead. And so those are grim facts, but that's about it. We've got to stop it. I have to tell you a little story. There's a George Orwell. People know about him, of course, and a famous author, wrote 1984. And they did the BBC did an amazing documentary on his life. And the actor who played it, you're convinced that's Orwell. And but he died in true life of tuberculosis, I think it was. And so the end of the documentary shows him on his deathbed. And he's being interviewed, interestingly enough, in the hospital or in his bed. He's propped up, he's having trouble breathing and so forth. And they portray a newspaper reporter, a young woman who's at the foot of the bed asking him questions, and he's trying to answer the questions. And she says, well, you have created a very grim picture about the future. And how do we prevent that from happening? She says, what do we do how do we avoid this kind of an ending to our civilization? And the answer is my answer. He gasped a little bit. He says, the only thing we can do is don't let it happen. And that's the end of the story. I believe in that line is the answer to all these questions. What do we do? Nothing is going to work in the long run if we let it happen. So our real major focus should not be how do we last a little bit longer than the other guy. Although that's important, the really important one is how do we not let it happen? That's my answer.
Question that I want to ask you, that I ask all my guests on my show is, the purpose of this podcast is really to inspire people to achieve greatness and enhance their overall personal well-being. So what is your definition of the word greatness?
My definition of the word greatness. Okay, I've never thought about that before, so I might want to amend my answer or change it. But right now, I would say greatness is often misunderstood as some quality that you admire in someone else. I'm going to redefine that as some quality in yourself that you feel good about and that you want to further develop. I think greatness really comes from your own self-evaluation. And you say, not that I'm great, but you think, I'm pretty good. I'm on the right track. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I wish I could do better, but I'm glad I'm doing what I can. I would say greatness is for a person to introspect on themselves and be able to say, I'm doing the best I can do. That would be greatness.
I think that's a beautiful definition. Now that you have a good feel for what my show is all about, who is a future guest, someone that you know personally that you would love to see on this show?
Well, let me think about that. That's a tough one to answer. I'd like to see all of my friends on your show. I'd like to see my wife on your show. She's a genius. She wrote a book on cancer too. Went to Dr. Richardson's clinic, and she's an RN, and she got all the files out and looked at them and prepared a book that's called Lateral Case Histories. Dr. Richardson wrote the first part, which was his experience, and she wrote the last half about all these patients that were condemned to die in 2 or 3 weeks. And here it is years later, they're out cutting wood or playing golf or water skiing and all these things. And but she won't do it. I'd like to see her on your show. I run into people all the time who have stories to tell. Like there was some gal there at the hotel, it was a waitress, telling a story about her recovery from cancer and what she did, and got off of all the toxic things in her life and stopped listening to doctors. That was her story. I'd like to see her on your show, but I don't know her name. I don't know. I'm sorry to fail you on this. I know you're probably looking for a celebrity type, maybe. Do I know any celebrity types that have a story to tell? Well, they're telling their stories already. You probably know who they are better than I. So I have to fail you on that one.
Edward, before we go, are there any other life lessons that you want to share with our audience?
There are a lot of life lessons. Sometimes they're small, but they're important. The one that keeps coming to mind I've already discussed, which is the fact that be grateful for your hardships, because they usually make a better person of you and put you in the right direction, whether you like it or not. That's a big lesson, actually. So when things happen to me that are uncomfortable or dreaded, I'd say, come on, remember your own life lesson, Adam. Remember, this is good for you, right? You should be happy that you're in misery right now. Hard to do, but it usually works out that way. Another one is, well, I remember I was in Czechoslovakia, and that's when somebody was publishing my book on cancer, in the Czechoslovak language. And so I was there on a kind of a book tour to promote the new publication of my book, World Without Cancer. So there we were in a hotel. There was a press conference that was held, and there was a little entourage of press people, there, reporters, and a cameraman there. I was surprised they did all that, because I didn't know, I wasn't expecting that. Anyway, there was about, I think about 9 reporters there, and cameras and that stuff. Wow. Well, they asked me questions about cancer and how I got into it and how it works and so forth. And at the end, this lady, this reporter asked me the same question. Do you have any last words of advice or so forth? Well, I hadn't thought it through, but I came up with something just on the spot that I was amazed at its profundity, so to speak. So I'm going to tell you what I said then, just right off the top of my head. I said, well, yeah, I think you should question authority. That's one. You should respect nature. That's 2. And you should do what your conscience tells you is right, regardless of what they say. That's 3. And I don't know, I don't think somebody must have been speaking through me, because I don't normally have that kind of perception, but I thought to myself, not too bad. I better follow that advice myself.
I really appreciate those final last words. And Edward, before we sign off today, where's the best place, for my listeners to follow your work? And also, I want to take this last moment to really thank you for being here today. It was a real honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's really, thanks for letting me ramble about that. I normally don't talk about my life so much, but it seems like a lot of people want to know, so I try to do my best. I haven't told you any of the bad things about me, so be aware there are some, okay? Well, anyway, thanks for inviting me, Ben. That's very kind of you, and anytime you want to continue, just let me know. We'll do some more.